On January 19, 1915, Sir Ernest Shackleton, leading 27 men, first caught sight of the Antarctic after 6 weeks of over 1,000 miles battling pack ice. This was the beginning of their journey to be the first to cross the surface of the Antarctic continent. However, soon their ship, named the Endurance, was crushed between ice floes and sank 10 months later. The ship's name epitomized the crew's total 19 months of enduring struggle to survive on the random, uncontrollable movements of ice floes, 3 open lifeboats, and an island never visited by humans. They hunted small seals and penguins for food and fuel. Large seals hunted them. They were plagued by frostbite and winter gales off wet, cold oceans during endless days of total darkness. They climbed over nameless mountains no one had ever crossed. Yet with Shackleton's encouragement, they all survived. Their true story, documented in their diaries and summarized in a book aptly titled Endurance, is considered to be one of the most heroic, true adventure stories in history. Often when they felt far from their goal but couldn't take sextant readings because of cloudy skies, they learned that they were very close when the light of the sun or stars did come out. Later, they would say they felt that there was an extra person with them, who was clearly God. Their perseverance with God's help carried them all to an ultimate rescue. Today's gospel also talks about perseverance. It refers to prayer when it says, "Pray always without becoming weary." Like the story of the Endurance, it is talking about enduring the difficult periods of prayer, which even the holiest of saints describe, most notably Saint Mother Teresa. But this is the strange part. Jesus uses a parable to describe a persistent widow who constantly asks a judge who is dishonest and normally unjust to give her justice. The judge finally gives her what she wants, since he is tired of her constant nagging. Then Jesus says, likewise, will not God then secure the rights of his chosen ones who call out to him day and night? It is almost as if Jesus is saying that you can badger God into action. Obviously, this is not the case. But what is Jesus saying? It is not that God succumbs to our pressure, but that our constant focus on God allows us to succumb to his loving presence within us, to experience and recognize his presence and show trust in him, just as the men of the Endurance experienced the additional person with them. It is not what we do to God, but that he allows us to see him within ourselves. His presence can be experienced through constant prayer, which is based on constant faith and thus hope. Paul captures this thinking in today's second reading when he says, "Be persistent, whether it is convenient or inconvenient. Convince, reprimand, encourage through all patience and teaching." That is what Shackleton did with his crew on the Endurance. In other words, we are not convincing God, but by our persistence, he is allowing us to be convinced by him of his infinite love for us. His will, not ours, be done. Today's first reading gives an example of Moses' persistence and endurance when it says, "As long as Moses kept his hands raised up, Israel had the better of the fight. Moses persevered in keeping his hands raised." Saints Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, both doctors of the Church, described the dry periods of prayer as the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the soul. But just like today's gospel, these feelings can be counterintuitive. Instead of a sign that God is absent, it really means God is close. When we have experienced God's presence, even unconsciously, it can be so sweet that our physical senses no longer give us as much pleasure. We may have less of an appetite, enjoyment of music, or good conversation. It is because that contrast that Teresa and John called this experience the dark night of the senses. The crew of the Endurance ate to live, not lived to eat. They described the disgusting taste of seal blubber, but their focus was on the bigger picture of physical survival. We must focus on the bigger picture of spiritual survival, since transcendence with God rather than on earthly pleasures alone. When we are in a room, the rug may seem clean, but when the bright lights come on, we may then be able to see the bugs and dirt that we couldn't previously see. Likewise, when God is close, the light of His presence makes more obvious the contrast between His purity and our failures. This can make us feel more distant from Him when He is actually closer. Teresa and John refer to this as the dark night of the soul. The crew of the Endurance often felt distant from their goal when they couldn't get sextant readings during the dark, overcast, endless Antarctic nights, and yet they were often very close to their goal. The extra person on the Antarctic adventure of the Endurance was God, who was very close to them. So it is in prayer. We are closer to God if we persevere through the dark nights. So how do we put to practical use Jesus' advice to pray unceasingly? One way is to say short 1 to 3 word prayers like Jesus, help me. Indeed, the shortest prayer is simply help. Repeating this often can consciously and at times unconsciously remind us to keep God in our life. This lets God badger us with His immense and incessant love for us. We may even let go of our thoughts and focus on a sacred word or image as a symbol of our desire to be with God. This may be a simple one word like love or peace, or it may be a shapeless image like a flame or a cloud. I sometimes do this with my eyes closed at stoplights for a few seconds. Rest assured, my foot is firmly on the brake, and those very infrequent times that I go too long, I can always depend on the person behind me to remind me that the light has changed. By the way, I don't do this at 60 miles an hour. The question is, can we keep our focus on the bigger picture of spiritual survival, indeed transcendence with God, or are we caught up in the everyday pleasures of the senses? Will we allow God to snuggle up to our heart? Will we allow God to relieve us of the necessity of badgering ourselves with the self-delusional thought that we can and must control everything? Isn't praying unceasingly the natural corollary to what monk Thomas Keating said? The love of God cradles us unceasingly.